Yeah, thank you for making time to join. It must be either late at night or early in the morning for some of you. If you're a precious weekday, whichever part of the day it is, thank you for joining. I am Singaporean, but have lived and worked in many different places. In the UK, in France. I am actually currently based in Tbilisi in Georgia. It's a bit of a politically sensitive place right now with the Ukraine situation, but quite an exciting place to be. That's me. I am an interdisciplinary artist. So I work across quite a few different media, including film, participatory interventions in public spaces, and theater, performance art, wearable art. So quite diverse. So I think a little bit of that also kind of means I never quite feel like I fit into anywhere. So that's it's a little short introduction to start things off. Nice to see that everyone's from so many different parts of the world. I wanted to start off with a little bit of context. So I started INSEP, International Network for Socially Engaged Practitioners, back in 2017. This was when I was kind of about to graduate from my university in London, and I was very into socially engaged practices, and I realized that not many peers around me or even my lecturers were into this topic, and it was difficult to find the kind of support that I was doing. I was back then doing a lot of experiments, so from theater I was kind of getting really frustrated with exhibition spaces and theater spaces where it was the same kind of artist group and intellectuals coming into these spaces. And I thought I needed to engage with real life and people that's happening out there with these social and political issues. So I started to do public interventions. And I realized when doing this that there were a lot of things around ethics and vulnerability that I needed to know about, which I didn't. And I was very keen to want to connect with other practitioners who have these kind of experiences, who understood what I was working with, and to kind of seek support. So from there on, I think it kind of like gradually built up as a way to hopefully create a platform in which people can come together and support one another. And while I was building it up, I was connecting with a lot of people over the years, I realized that I was connecting with a lot of practitioners who weren't just artists. They weren't just creative practitioners. They were maybe working in tech, working in social innovation, but they were nonetheless still doing socially engaged and participatory work. And I think for me, that made me sort of expand INSEP to, beyond just the arts. And I think the term practitioners gives it a sort of like a broad enough term to encompass and create a space that people from other sectors can also come in. And I also, from there on, realized that there was a lot of opportunities, for cross-sector collaborations, etc. And I think this is sort of a little bit of context of INSEP. And I think when I first started INSEP, for the first number of years, I was organizing like online conversations and sharing, but it was too much on one person, on me to organize all of these different things and organize notes. So then I realized that as the network expanded, it was very much revolving around me, and I wanted in some ways to decentralize that. We do have a Facebook group, but also I started Onion's Talk podcast to be able to bring sort of like it's almost like a directory on its own, an online directory of the incredible people who are doing this kind of work in different parts of the world. So like, feel free to listen to the conversations, and if any one of them is interesting to you and you would like to connect, and if you want me to do an introduction, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to do so. So do check it out. The links are in the chat. And if you want to join the Facebook group, I post resources and stuff on there time to time. So that is that for INSEP. Next slide, please. So we're gonna have a bit of time now. I will explain a little bit more about the context of this session, about cross-sector projects and some of my experiences after this breakout session. But I think like everyone would be quite keen to get connected with one another and to meet each other. So, you'll have 15 minutes to about your experiences working in or with non-art spaces. What were some of the challenges and advantages? Yeah, have a good chat, and I will meet you back here. I hope everyone managed to have a good conversation. If you like, you could type out on the chat briefly, some interesting things that you talked about or some questions that you might have around, be it difficulty in getting funding, or I don't know, what were some of the challenges or advantages in working with non-art spaces. We could always go back to it later when we have the Q&A to start more of a discussion afterwards. So feel free to type it out on the chat. I'm gonna sort of resume the little presentation. Madeleine, if you could go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to give a little bit of context to this cross-sector partnerships session, because so from where I left off with INSEP, I started a podcast and there were these different contact points, but it was very much conversational still and very much online because it's an international network. And I realized that, if we want to strengthen the kind of ecosystem that we have and the communities that we have, then maybe the way to do so is to really start doing projects together so that we can actually get to learn how to work together with each other, how to actually cross these sectors and innovate, find new ways of creating processes that we could work with one another. And I think this whole idea for Sustenarts really came about to bring together sustainability, enterprises, and the arts. I was thinking a lot about sustainability and impact, and it's not just about problems, it's also about solutions. Whereas I feel like in the arts, we often kind of tend towards highlighting the problems instead of solutions. And I think the urgency of the issues with all these different problems, including climate, racial justice, all of these different issues, it's very urgent and change needs to happen fast. But then change can also only accelerate when we start changing cultures, narratives, and ways of working together as a society. And I see the arts as one part of the larger change ecosystem, but it's not enough on its own to create systemic change. And the interconnections across sectors in the change ecosystem matters. And we need to work across sectors. But then where are the gaps that we can fill in other sectors within the change ecosystem where the arts can be useful? Where are the potential and opportunities across sectors in politics, social innovation, nonprofits, businesses? So then Sustenarts really came together as a way of trying to pull things together. And this was formed as an attempt to move towards action and collaboration. And I think this, with a sort of a clear climate agenda, it was around how could we encourage the adoption of climate actions and solutions. So a little bit of context for this project. It was funded by National Arts Council Singapore. So their angle is that they're interested in financial sustainability and new income opportunities for the arts. I'm sharing this project because there are a lot of interesting learning points. It was quite a difficult process when I was doing the project, but I thought this could be useful for everyone. So I'm just kind of breaking it down to the different elements of the project so that hopefully this would help if you want to start your own cross-sector projects in the future, or if you are currently, reflecting about it as you're working on some stuff right now. And so that was the National Arts Council perspective. They were like, right, the arts are too dependent on government funding. So then this is interesting if the money is going to be able to come from corporates in the future, potentially. So that was really the mandate, like why they wanted to support it. And then the startups came in with a very practical approach. I think, first of all, they were all open to the arts. That had to be the sort of first step. Without that kind of openness, the project would not have been possible. But they were also very practical. They wanted free social media outreach and company branding. So when we first started the conversations, it was actually very much a superficial understanding of the arts. Like, right, so are you going to make infographics for us? Is it going to be about graphic design? And it was a lot of conversations and bridging of the different languages. And then there was also this thing around languages and terminology, because the startups were very scientific. They were like biotech firms, and they pretty much started the company, most of them, based on their PhD research. So imagine when the artists came in, it was a lot of science, there was a lot of jargon, yet on the other hand, the arts also had our kind of terminology and vocabulary and way of working, which the startups didn't understand. And the kind of understanding of the arts back then was very much like, right, the arts that we know of in Singapore, it's sculptures, it's paintings. People didn't really have that much of an exposure of what kind of arts are there and available, much less socially engaged arts. So that was an entire process that you had to start from scratch to have a sort of common understanding, not just for the startups to understand the arts, but for the artists to understand the science and the ways that the startups worked. And I remember at the very beginning, there was a lot of like, right, so are you going to make a video of my research lab so that we can put it on a website? It was very much that kind of publicity conversation. And it was a difficult process for artists as well, because they had to be very open and patient, and they had to learn how to communicate their art practice and explain it to the startup so that there's a common understanding. So there were three different projects. I was also working as an artist within one of the projects. So one of the companies is Sapure. They are a chemical filtration company. So of the world's, a lot of the products that we use, including like cooking oil and pharmaceutical products, require chemical filtration. And that takes up about like, I think 15% of the world's energy consumption to filtrate it through heat-based processes. So Sapure invented this technology in which that filtration can happen at room temperature, which means the energy consumption for that filtration process can be cut by up to 90%. So imagine 15% of the world's energy consumption could be cut by 90%. So that's actually huge. But it's also a lot of science. When we went to the labs, it was a lot of scientific like test tubes and all these equipments that I've not even seen in my life. And it was very, very scientific. It was about like nano kind of, I don't even know what the terms were. So it was a long process of understanding. Teora, on the other hand, is a biotech firm. So they are, I think the simplest way to explain it is that humans need like vaccines, so do animals. And there is a lot of like destruction in the ecosystem. So especially in the sort of agriculture food systems. So what they're trying to do is use organic products like algae, bacteria, yeast, to create these kinds of vaccines for animals. I'm not even explaining it that well because imagine the kind of like 7 months process. It was a lot of science. And this was the task of the artist to break it down in a way that would actually engage with the public at the end in some sort of way, a kind of socially engaged outcomes. And then the final project, which is the one that I worked on, there were two organizations involved actually. One is the startup Asia Insect Farm Solutions. So really exciting. It was about insect protein. And then the other is Slice. So Slice is actually funded by a huge institution in Singapore called JTC. Anyway, they are kind of like funded by, all the land in Singapore that is rented out is kind of given to JTC to handle. They kind of are government, but then they work pretty much like a private so that it's more efficient. But anyway, it means you're collecting rent from all over like Singapore. So they have a lot of money. And then they created this little experiment hub called Slice. It was started by a few sort of employees who were really keen about like future of food. And they wanted to create a space that would support startups that were involved in future of food kind of experiments. So Asia Insect Farm Solutions was one of the startups that they were supporting alongside a lot of other projects that they were doing at their space in their kitchen. So this was how the three different projects came together. I'm gonna go into the projects themselves so that you get a little bit more context and some pictures of what the projects are about. So next slide, please. So there were three different outcomes from the 7 months of engagement in the project. What happened for Teora was that the artists in working with Teora started to go into the labs, and they were, she was, observing a lot of their processes. And because at that time they were experimenting a lot with algae. And in that process, Wendy realized that, right, the green that the algae was producing was really interesting. Could that be made into paint? So then she started experimenting with that, and it was super interesting. And in the end, I think there was the thing about smell and all that, and she couldn't quite get the right consistency. And then she had to go onto online community forums and stuff. And Tiara was super excited by it because, you know, they were kind of like experimenting with algae, but they never thought of the possibility of creating paint with algae. So then they were starting to have these really exciting conversations around whether it's possible to create a product line out of it. And the thing about Tiara is that we had these different workshops from the beginning to align expectations. So what is it that you expect out of the project? What is it that you want to gain out of it? What are you in this project for? What is it that you want to contribute or experiment with? And I think for Tiara, it was a bit difficult to get to it. They took quite a few weeks because they are fundamentally a buyer to buyer company. They weren't selling directly to consumers. So the kind of public engagement was a bit difficult to get to because it's kind of indirect, you know, like what do you engage the public for? But what was interesting was this algae painting workshop that Wendy eventually organized altogether. She invited Tiara, the employees, as well as the founder to the event. I think eventually the founder had COVID and she couldn't go, but then her staff went, and she has a PhD in like basically algae. She was the perfect person to be there in the session. And it was they were painting with these different algae paint, but it was a session where they could also ask about algae and all the different research that Tiara was doing with them, and the sort of impact on the food ecosystem, and what their company is trying to do to be able to support that. And it was a very informative conversation, and everyone had a lot of fun. They were painting, but then they were also learning a lot about the science alongside it. And the person who was the staff of Tiara who was there, afterwards she shared that she was super inspired after going to that session, because, you know, there was so much human connection that was happening in that space, and that when they were having all these conversations, she felt like this is her purpose, and this is what she's wanting to do to serve and contribute to the world. But she doesn't always have the opportunity to connect with people on that level, to share the work that Tiara is doing, or the work that her research contributes towards. And she felt a lot more energized after the session to continue her research work with Tiara. So there was some of the sort of feedback from that. There are 3 different podcast episodes to highlight in details the different processes for these different projects. Feel free to check it out later, because I don't think it'd be possible for me to go super in depth in details of the process of that 7 months with all 3 projects. The other one, if we can go to the next slide, please. It's my project with Asia Insect Farm Solutions. So their product is actually cricket powder. And the thing about insect protein as an alternative to meat is that actually environmentally, if you analyze it, there is a lot less water consumption and carbon footprint, because, like, say crickets, for example, you don't need much land space. You can have like sort of vertical farm, and they don't need as much water. There's not much like carbon footprint, and to process them, I think they kind of freeze them first. So it's okay, maybe it might be a bit morbid, but so they freeze the crickets first, so it's a very comfortable way to dye, and then afterwards they would heat it up and process it and grind it into powder. So they kind of have a good sort of like start to end of life kind of cycle. And the thing about insects is that for a lot of people it's disgusting. So how do you overcome the yuck factor and consume it? And lifestyle change is often easier when you're doing it together with others. So it was really interesting because the founder, Yuvanesh, of Asia Insect Farm Solutions, he's been doing this research for many years since starting the company. And, you know, there were all of these different like psychological ways of looking at why people would engage. So he was seeing that there were a lot of people who were in their 20s or 30s who were interested in this like trendy, like cool food that I've never tried before kind of like perspective. So then that's kind of why they want to try it. And then there are like kind of, you know, a bit of outliers here and there, like, oh, maybe my friend tried it and then I just want to kind of see what it's like, or oh, maybe I'm really interested in like environment, and I don't have enough protein in like vegetarian diets, but then, you know, I still want to do my part for the environment, so maybe there's something that I want to go into. So then we organized, we had a lot of conversations from the beginning, because there were these two other partners alongside me. So we had all these different conversations on how we could organize a sort of engagement session. Also mind, this was a project that was carried out during COVID. So it was really difficult to organize anything physical, because we were going like back into lockdowns, and then, okay, you have to be restricted. And then there was another wave, and we had to, you know, we had to be very like flexible and adaptable to the current situation. We originally were thinking about, you know, could we engage with young people, like kids, for example, because education is important. And then it's funny, because we ended up back at a point of our purpose. So what is it among the three of us that made us care about the environment? And then we started to think back about our life experiences. We started to think about the communities we were engaged with. And we realized, you know, it was like overseas exposure, for example, and being with other people, and gradually learning from community around us about the importance of this issue, and being driven to want to actually do something ourselves. So then we thought, okay, right, how could we then create this insect protein pals? So almost like a little bit of a community among us, that we can open up to other people, so that we can allow more people to join this community to actually do something. So it was, you know, with that reflection of what will make people go from, I am receiving this information, that this is an urgent issue, to me actually wanting to take action. So that was really kind of what grounded the project. And we were doing all these different community-driven series of online and offline engagement. There was quite a lot of social media posts as well, if you want to check out the Instagram. Because of the COVID situation and context, we tried online engagements and different ways of using social media to see if we could have some sort of like response. And then there was also like these Zoom conversations that we had with different people to get a bit of like feedback, but also to just connect with one another, and know where they're coming from and why they're interested in this topic. And the activities were designed in a way that would open up conversations and relationship building among participants. Next slide, please. And we had a final cricket powder Christmas cook-off. So this was really interesting. The participants were tasked to cook local dishes with cricket powder. There was this golden ratio of about 30 to 40% of cricket powder to flour ratio. And it was a very intentional community, because I think when we started doing the project, we realized it was impossible to engage with like thousands of people. I mean, well, we might have that kind of reach on social media over the months, but like the kind of reach on social media is also very touch and go. It's kind of superficial in a way. People see it and then, you know, you scroll past it and that's it. I wouldn't know how engaged they would be on this topic afterwards, or if there would be any action taken from there. So we started to think, okay, how could we create an intentional community? And in the end, for the Christmas cook-off, we ended up attracting participants from very different backgrounds. They were working in sustainability or actively volunteering in this space. And we split them up into pairs or trios in which they would not have known the person before this session. So that was a way for them to use the sort of cooking as almost like an attraction entry point for them to build the kind of closer relationships with one another. And the pairs and trio continued to keep in touch. Some of them were working in nonprofits and they connected over their kind of work in that space, or that, you know, they were both interested in sustainability and they were thinking, okay, how could we work together again? And because they were all from such different backgrounds, like food science, sustainability research, but also healthcare, logistics, PR, agriculture, nonprofits, it created a kind of like synergy. This is kind of my theory that if the more that we connect beyond the sectors that we conventionally work with, the more like intersections that we have, the stronger the change ecosystem becomes, and the more opportunities and potential there would be for innovation. So that's kind of really what grounds the work. And I think this is also a long-term process that needs to be continued. One-off events it's not enough. But then also we face this issue of like funding, right? Usually projects funding is just for one project, but then it doesn't fund you for 10 years to just engage with different communities. So I mean, that's another conversation altogether, but just a sort of question point to see. Next slide, please. The final project that we had, it's with the project with Sapure and an audio artist. So this project was a difficult project. There were several issues that happened during the project, and I wanted to share about this because I think it's interesting learning point, but I'm not gonna go too far into the details of the conflicts and stuff. Basically, the artist was, she was quite busy over the 7 months of the project, and she just over the months, she slowly became less and less engaged. And at the end of the project, the founder of the startup was quite upset, and he sent an email saying that this was a complete waste of time and that it didn't serve the company's interest. And I think I'm going to summarize some of the sort of like key points, which is that I think this kind of project it's a very self-driven and independent process. So we actually had an exhibition as part of Singapore Art Week. The artist didn't really prepare much for the exhibition, and also her husband got COVID, so she wasn't there for the exhibition. And the only sort of outputs that she was creating were a few really short interviews with the startup employees about pretty generic stuff around like body soaps, for example, or vitamin C pills, which was kind of related to the science of what Sapure was doing, but doesn't directly talk about what the company actually does. So on that note, for the artist, she saw it as a research process. For the startup, they just saw it as this doesn't help with my company at all, because it's not even related to our product. And there was a bit of a conflict there. And I think there was also a lot of like lack of communication because she was largely absent. And at the end, eventually, I asked if she could do an audio documentary. She didn't really have ideas of how to continue, and I think she didn't really want to continue with the project either. And eventually, that was what she created. Some of a summary of like the points in working in such projects is, because it's so self-driven and independent, there is, even at points when the artist is uninspired, you still need the motivation to continue this work. So I think this kind of project is really not for everyone. And because there is a lot of science in these kinds of projects, I think at some point it was boring for the artist, and she didn't feel like she got inspirational ideas to continue with it. And there is also the need to be able to synthesize and be creative in between spaces. I think this is a challenging project because it's not a conventional context of the arts. It's not a project that serves the artist. I think I will talk about this a little bit later in the next slide, but it's also about understanding stakeholders and expectations. If the arts work in education, there is a different kind of expectation as when if the arts is working in the arts kind of like gallery spaces, or like arts institution funding the artist to create a work, because on that kind of level, it doesn't matter what the artists create, because the institution fundamentally believes that there is an artistic value, cultural value that it creates. Whereas like if you're working in education, for example, then education, it's the beneficiary of the people that you're working with that is receiving their education, that should have some sort of learning outcomes. And I think for this kind of project, also because it was a first, it was also like, what were the stakeholders' expectations that had to be answered? And this was not a project that fully served the artist's interest. This was actually beyond that. This was, I would say, about serving the larger sustainability theme topic, and then also like trying to balance it out among all the different stakeholders. I will go into that more details later. But there was also a need for honesty and open communication, because over the months, we actually had very regular check-in sessions, almost weekly. And she communicated that everything was okay until I think 2 months before the end of the project, when there wasn't outputs, and then all these problems started to surface, and I realized that there was a huge break in communication. But I think it was probably a difficult process for the artists as well, because honesty and open communication to when you're struggling with it is also, I think there is a thing about pride as well, and confidence when you fail to deliver, or you're struggling to deliver, or you're feeling stuck and unmotivated or uninspired in a creative process. Then it could be quite a sort of like it could be seen as quite a personal blow. And I think for me, juggling between artist and project manager, producer, what I would really appreciate was honesty and open communication for me to be able to understand that early in the process, so that I could intervene if necessary. And I think there was also something about humility, because it's a very humbling experience for artists to have to explain the value of your art, because we are working with people who are not in the art spaces. They don't understand the arts, and you have to explain from scratch what the arts is, but also what is the value of your work. And there are artists who maybe don't want to do that, because like I maybe they think like, I don't want to have to explain my art. This is what it is. Leave it or take it. This is where it is. But then not doing that and not going through that process, I feel it's also missing out on the full experience of such cross-sector collaborations, because a lot of it was about communication and relationship building. It's almost like dating, but then instead of like dating to get to know one another on a more personal level, you're actually getting to learn about each other's like knowledge and experiences in completely different sectors. So the next slide. If you have questions, you can feel free to ask later. The next slide is about stakeholders, which I realized was a really important thing to consider in such cross-sector projects, because as a project manager and producer for the project, it was such a difficult process over the months, because there were so many different expectations from different perspectives. How do you satisfy everyone? Do I need to satisfy everyone? How do you move from transactional cooperation to true collaboration? So there were a lot of elements to this. Firstly, like the funder, and if the funder were to be the startups, it's kind of a bit difficult, because there are positive externalities to this project that will benefit the whole ecosystem. So for example, when I was talking to Yuvanesh about insect protein, us doing this project doesn't just benefit Asia Insect Farm Solutions, it benefits all the other companies and startups that are working with insect protein. So then for the startup to actually fund the project, it's a bit difficult also, because startups in their kind of phases, early stages, are also bootstrapped and unlikely to want to pay for it, as it's a high cost, high risk experiment. But then there might be other opportunities that might exist in sustainability funding, be it on like national levels or from foundations, or startup fundings that are especially for PR. If you have more questions on this, we can go a bit deeper afterwards if you ask it in the questions Q&A part. And for our funder for this project, National Arts Council, they were interested in how this kind of like intersection with enterprise would work out. But then I think the thing about like a social good, common good kind of project is that the positive externalities benefit the whole ecosystem. So then it's difficult to find a buyer for it, especially in the sort of enterprise space. And then you find this situation where it feels like no matter which way you go, you kind of still need to have a larger sort of common good buyer, and the largest common good buyer is actually governments. Other than that, it would be foundations or philanthropy. But these kind of mindset shifts and changes would actually require something on a much larger scale, on a national scale, and actually it would make sense for governments to step in. this was my conclusion after this project, but I don't think this was necessarily what National Arts Council wanted to hear from, because they were wanting to, you know, find something, projects that would try and find income, financial revenue, and opportunities from beyond the art spaces. And this was kind of like what it was. But then there was also a lot of conversations that I was having with National Arts Council, and they were quite open to listen and hear about like the feedback and all of this. I think the good thing about Singapore context was that that we had a new sort of Ministry of Sustainability that was set up to address this climate issue, and they started to also roll out sustainability funding that you could apply for different projects. So that was an opportunity that could be tapped upon. So on my own, I'm really small, but I hope that sharing this work in my projects will inspire more of you to explore more of such innovations and connect with other parts of the change ecosystem, because there's really a lot of opportunity and potential out there, even though it can be a difficult process. But also I wanted to go back onto the point around like stakeholders and horizontality. So I think what I learned from this project is also that no one is serving anyone. And it's important to understand this as a co-creation process. And actually the startups come in and do the work as much as artists are. I think at the start, there was a bit of expectation that, right, because the startups were creating these solutions, then they felt like, you know, everything was to serve their products because their product was the solution. But actually, in retrospect now, the projects that worked well, the best, was when we really went back and saw each collaborator as an individual and a human being, and what you wanted to work upon, what is the purpose, and how could we, you know, have fun together, create something meaningful together, and contribute. And I think that kind of like horizontal way of contributing all towards the same cause produce the kind of best outcome eventually for the project, and also like the kind of synergy that will allow such projects to continue even beyond this sort of funding cycle. There's, as part of my other work outside of the arts, for an organization called Social Innovation Exchange, we're producing a podcast called the Social Innovation Eurovision. And there was this episode, it's not yet published. It will be the next episode that will be published, but I really wanted to share about this because this is a French organization called La 27e Région, which is the 27th region. They are a public sector innovation sort of organization. They're commissioned by public sector, but to help them with innovation. But at the start of the project, they communicate what they expect their commissioner to do and be responsible for. So then you balance the power in a way that doesn't create a sort of transactional consultancy. And I thought this was such an important point. You know, they were detailing in the Stefan was detailing in the podcast about how, you know, these governments, they are like the big thugs, you know. They come in with all the power, and if you don't speak up for yourself and balance that power, then you would completely lose out. But then for these kinds of like innovation processes, it's so important to work horizontally with one another side by side. And I think this is really good sort of philosophy for us to also learn from in these kinds of projects, but also in the arts. And I think the big question around money, right? Like who would fund such high-risk experiments? I think some of the points that I learned, it's like good communication with funder and finding the right funder that understands the importance of such experiments that could build critical cross-sector relationships and possibly lead to unexpected innovations. This kind of goes back to my starting point and my write-up for this sharing, which is that a lot of the urgent issues that is in our world right now, there are so many of them, and we need to kind of work on them really fast and quickly. And I feel in a way we are stuck because we've been working the same way that we've been working before. But the ways in which we could innovate isn't just about creating like a new sector or a new technology. It's also about how could we innovate our processes or our ways of working with one another, or our relationships with each other in an ecosystem. And I feel like this is potentially a huge space that we can explore, which I feel once we set up the kind of foundations for these cross-sector relationships and innovations to happen, change can actually accelerate a lot faster once that ecosystem is interlinked. And then a little bit more about the context of the project, where does it sit? Because like education, arts, social innovation, they all have different expectations. If it's to be centralized, if it's to be put into the context of social service, then, the beneficiaries that you're working with, the public you're working with, the kind of policy outcomes that you want to go towards, all of that would become part of the deliverables. And then where does the arts come in to serve that? And finally, I kind of like want to end this with the importance of building more projects as examples that would advocate for our sector and the work that we do. I work in the social innovation space, and I think a lot of times I have these conversations with people who are, working on the ground social innovation projects that would eventually, hopefully, lead to scaling to a national level or even regional level, and to influence policies. And I'm like, right, the community engagement work that you are not experiencing, artists are really good at that. But then I kind of also felt like I wasn't in the right position with enough case studies or like good, these kind of cross-sector examples to be able to bring it to them and be like, propose to them, right, this is what we could potentially discover and achieve together. So I feel like as a sector, we do need more of such examples so that we can slowly build more of such connections and interconnections, and to be able to build up also more work opportunities for us in other spaces, because there's always a lot more money in those spaces than just within the arts. Also, like within the arts spaces, I think where socially engaged art sits, it's a bit tricky, because it's not necessarily something that looks good for exhibitions. Like if you want to create an exhibition, you have to create something else altogether from that process so that it fits the exhibitions and maybe the aesthetics that they're looking for. Whereas socially engaged art, it's almost like a mix of your socially engaged work that's working with the communities you're working with, that's trying to be horizontal, that's trying to serve the communities, but then you're also trying to develop somehow your practice in that process. But then also, like, I find always kind of difficult in this in-between spaces where I have to change my narrative wherever I go. If I want to work in an exhibition context, I have to change the products that I'm producing for them or the outcomes. If I'm working on a very community level, then it's about serving the expectations almost of what the community funder wants, but also like engaging with the community, be it like place-based or public spaces. And like what does this mean for our work in between all of that spaces, beyond the expectations of funders and the institutions that could house us? Could we also talk about what we as artists, socially engaged artists, want to do and contribute, and what does that space look like for us? I've got like all of these questions, and also how there is a lot that we can contribute to in terms of changing narratives and cultures, which are not necessarily the niche of other sectors. But then how could we play our part and contribute our skills in this larger movement? How could we work collectively to make our voices heard in politics, in foundations, in corporates? These are questions that I'm asking to everyone, because I see a lot of opportunities there, and me alone, I feel it's not enough. Like if more of us advocate for it and work in different spaces, there is so much more that we can achieve. I'm gonna pause. Next slide, please. This is questions time, because I think I feel like I've been talking a lot. I'm getting thirsty now, so I'm very keen to hear from everyone. I've not managed to look at the chat yet. Let's go through. If anyone wants to unmute yourself, ask questions or share, please feel free to do so.
While everyone sort of digests and figures out a question that from all of that, there are a couple in the chat which I think are worth highlighting, Fié, if you don't mind. And one was from a colleague before they had to leave, which said, how do you define the difference between transactional versus true collaboration? And how do you define success in a cross-sector collaboration? So those are probably two very different questions, but maybe we could start with that while people are formulating a question in their mind.
Where was the question? What was the first one again?
The first one was, how do you define the difference between transactional versus true collaboration?
I have to say everything is very rooted in relationships. It's very gray. Um, okay, I feel I with the context of this project, I can give a bit of comparison. Um, I think with Tiara, they really wanted a video of their lab, which for us really didn't serve much because it was just video of a lab that didn't speak much. And I think right till the very end of the project, they were still asking for a video of the lab. And Wendy and I had a lot of conversations, and we're like, this is not quite the direction we're working towards. And I think in that sense, it somehow felt a bit transactional. Also, I think maybe the most transactional that of the three could probably be Sepure's, where they were very clear because they're a startup with that's already expanded to Canada and other countries, and they've received like millions in terms of funding rounds. So what they needed at this time is scale and publicity at scale. So the kind of what they were looking for in terms of their publicity, it was very much like, this is my business model. This is what my business needs right now. Where the arts can fit is where the publicity is at. So it was very much looking at that from the business kind of mindset. Whereas I think this kind of project, if I reflect upon my relationship with the two organizations I worked with, there were many ways that they could maybe ask more of like me as an artist or exploited, but eventually we were beyond all that, and we just started to talk about, right, like what is this learning experience for us? We all love like being in communities, being with communities. How could we all contribute our part to it? And at some point I realized that Yuvanesh, the founder of Asian Insect Farm Solutions, he was giving us the cricket powder to experiment with and work with, but he wasn't really asking me much. Like, I mean, I was doing some sharing on social media, but it very much felt like, right, Fié, what do you need? How can I contribute? How could I help you with your arts project? How could we, do this together? And he knew from our podcast discussion, like it was very clear to him that doing this project might benefit his company, but not necessarily as well, because they were for 2-3 years, the Singapore National Food Agency, they've never dealt with insect food before, so they've not approved it. So for 3 years they were waiting for approval. They couldn't sell their product. So basically we were doing all these social media, and I couldn't pop any links in for them to sell it either. For them it was really like, I'm just here because like this is interesting. I've never worked with the arts. This is fun, and we really just love to be with other sort of like people who are interested in sustainability, to build this community together. And now the kind of conversations that we're having among the group isn't so much about, it's not even about publicity for the company. It's like, right, is there another funding we can apply for together? How could we work with each other so that we can, continue this relationship and reach out to more people, because it was an interesting, enjoyable and fun experience. So I feel like a lot of it is based upon like relationships, probably like personal relationships, friendships. And I think because it's projects in the social good space, I feel everyone comes in with a purpose. So when you really connect on the fundamental level on the purpose and what you wish to contribute to the world, I feel like that kind of relationship and bond is a lot stronger than the kind of conventional business transactional relationship. I don't know if that answers the question. I hope. What was the next again?
The other one was about, how do you define success in cross-sector collaborations?
Actually, I feel like there were a lot of challenges during this project, and there were conflicts as well, but I don't see them as failure at all, because I see them all as a learning process. When you've not done a project that's been done this way before, whatever you learn is incredibly valuable knowledge that could then add on to like the next project to be done better, to be reiterated better, to be able to build the kind of right context, situation, or the kind of structure. Maybe structure is not quite the right word. Environment for more of such kind of cross-sector projects to be held in a better way for everyone in terms of, be it aligning expectations, etc. So all of the things that I learned in this project, including the conflicts and all the things that didn't go well with it, they were super informative for me to be able to design the next kind of such projects. So I feel like in terms of cross-sector projects, there is like the learning part, there is the outcome part, which I think for every kind of project, it's also about aligning expectations. If your expectation is that you want to reach, 5,000 people and on social media, and if you don't reach that, is that a failure? When you've had lots of process in between, that was a lot of incredible learning. So maybe it's not so much about like what makes a project successful, but how could you expand okay, I hate this term evaluation because this is what funders love to hear, right? But then like, how could you expand the ways in which you look at the potential learning outcomes for the project, so that, in this way, if you have an open-ended way of looking at this project, it's not going to be like a like singular success versus failure kind of like way of looking at things. It's going to be a lot more open than that. And it's going to be about, what are the new processes of working together and relationships that we've innovated together. Because I feel any sort of cross-sector work, if you deep dive into that kind of experiment to work together with one another and build that relationship, anything that's learned and would be valuable knowledge and learning, precisely because it's not been done before. So I wouldn't see of anything as, say, a failure. Probably everything would be successful just to which level that you wanted that success to be.
Yeah, I'm going to point you towards the chat because there's some interesting questions come in, specifically a few here from Christopher, which maybe you want to take a look at. Christopher, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask, or yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Let me just go back to my questions. I got so excited writing them. What they were. One was, in working with nature, like insects and algae, I might have a project that gets into that. Do you have like a contract participants sign? Like, I understand that this could be unsafe, I could have allergies, and I'm willing to accept this, my own responsibility. Did you have anything like that? That's one question. Or would you?
Yeah, we had that for the insect project, precisely because crustacean allergy, so like people who are allergic to shellfish, crabs, etc., most likely they would be allergic to insects. So we had a sort of form that we let people sign for, because they were going to consume the food that they made. So that was something that was signed. But then for the algae, there wasn't, because it wasn't consumed, it was just paint. So that was that.
Oh, that's good. So you do have that. Okay, that's good. And my other question was, we talked about expectations. That was very interesting and important. Would you ever have a contract for that philosophically defines what expectations are, what they won't be, and what's acceptable?
Yeah, Christopher, I'm really glad that you brought up this point, because I remember at one point during the project wanting to pull my hair out because it was so difficult, like as a project manager and producer. And I had a chat with my friend who was also a socially engaged artist, and we talked about this, like philosophy around like ethics, responsibility, expectations. I had a contract for everyone to sign, startups and artists from the beginning. But the thing is, I didn't know what to expect of the project. So it was something that was very vague. It was like to fulfill like the completion of the project. And there were certain things that were outlined for the artists specifically, and that the startups were aware of from the beginning, because of the proposal that everyone had access. And I think it was like 5 social media posts over the 7 months, and public engagement event, and commitment to like conversations with the startups. It was something like this that was super open, because I didn't want to specify or design the outcomes before they've even started this journey.
Yeah.
So it was purposely open, which eventually I think most of the outcomes were achieved except for the one project. But we had conversations at the end to like wrap it up and round it off. Yeah, and I think I would probably need a bit more like reflections in terms of how a next iteration would be designed. Maybe perhaps more than like, okay, some of my insights, which my learning might be useful. I think in a second run, I would probably engage with the artists that I would want to work with beforehand, before I start a sort of project, to align on one like socially engaged practice, because everyone came with such different understanding of what it is. And some, like one of the artists actually didn't really want to socially engage. For her, like her audio is socially engaged already because someone is listening to it. So I would think like some sort of, even like not say lessons, but some sort of like courses that they would have to take in advance, or some sort of common and understanding established in advance first would be super helpful. And then instead of shaping this as a sort of like project with deliverables, maybe in a sort of like education learning journey together, where you have to learn together, and the outcomes is not so much like just producing something, but also like to be part of those conversations and to learn from one another. I feel like that's an important part.
Yeah.
So instead of, I don't know, maybe there is a way of shaping it in a way of like a learning journey or a process, and that they would have a sort of honorarium or stipend, or like, you know, for each session that you engage together and learn together, you get to, I don't know, you get access to the funding that's for that session. I feel like some of these should be in place. And then at the end, the kind of like working together, it's almost like the next part of the project of delivering something together and co-creating, which actually every stakeholder is an equal contributor to that. Sorry, I think I'm kind of like, I drifted quite far off from your question. I don't remember what the question was.
No, that's excellent. And it gets sent into my last question, which was, you mentioned, can we extend the ways and which you kind of described a little bit. For instance, if you can't get all the people you want on social media, what do you get? And my thought was, maybe can that kind of thing connect kind of the possibilities for your, you know, materialistic objectives be redefined in like a grid or a contract, or an explanation that while we may or may not get social media, even if we do, it might not be good. But what will be good out of this process or in this result or each step of the way? Do you do that, or would you consider doing that kind of a checklist, I guess, of what you may get, what you may not get?
Okay, so for National Arts Council, what they asked for was like a clear breakdown of how many impressions we had and engagement. And we had to do a formula thing where like a percentage of engagement versus over impression kind of thing that we had to divide and all that. I think altogether for the project, we had like 30 over 1,000 impressions. But the thing is, I honestly feel at the end of it, this was besides the point. People through our networks on social media might, you know about it because they scroll and then they think like, oh, that's interesting that you're working on this, but it felt very much like a touch and go kind of thing. I think with my work with INSEP over the years is that there is a phase from like when the person is interested, cares about an issue, knows about the issue, cares about the issue, wants to work on the issue, and actively commits to the action. And I think that space where the people care enough to want to commit to something is actually the space that the people that you really want to activate. Because honestly, everything else before, it doesn't contribute much to the kind of social change without commitment. So I feel like I think one of my struggle with socially engaged practice over my years is that you go like wide and you engage lots of people in numbers, or you go deep. And it's very difficult to achieve both at the same time. But then the thing about going deep, which a lot of our kind of work does, is super impactful and powerful, because you are potentially creating, like, you are turning these buttons and knots where this is the potential for transformation, where the individual would actually be inspired enough or care enough about the topic after a series of engagement that they would actually actively act upon something themselves. And I think rooting this in community practice is important, because if you are alongside other people who are also working towards such work, it means that you have community support. It means that you get motivated because your peers are working on this topic. And it means that it's a much less lonely journey, which is very important in this phase. A lot of times it's very lonely. So I feel now I'm kind of looking at things in terms of that range. There is the touch and go social media that could be useful, but then I'm also increasingly looking more at all the potential spaces that could be activated and people, and how do I work with them and bring them together so that I'm sharing my social capital and that they can continue being motivated and energized to continue to work without burning out. So I think that's like where my perspective is.
No, wonderful. Thank you.
I'm just reading all the comments. If anyone wants to unmute and share something, please do. This is an open space.
I'd like to jump in. This is Barry, and I'm a theater teaching artist based in Atlanta, in Georgia, in the US. And it's not so much a question, or maybe it's a comment or an observation. Something I thought I heard you say, Fié, and I'm not sure if it came through, but at one point, did you say something like, no one is serving anyone? Was there something like that?
So I meant that as, I think because at the start, the startups might have the expectation that artists are serving them and their company's products. So I felt at the end, what was actually really useful is taking all that apart and really going back down to what is the purpose, what is our end goal. And actually everyone was motivated to work towards sustainability. And actually that is the social change that we are working towards. We are not necessarily serving each other, but we are serving the goal that we have in common. And I think that is a better, more horizontal way of grounding the project than just, yeah.
Well, I asked that, and I didn't mean to, I hope it didn't come across as challenging in any way, but, and this kind of connects, I think, with one of Eric Booth's comments. I can't remember what he said. Oh, and maybe with some of what you said about transactional versus true collaboration, which I had to step away for some of it. But I know even in my teaching artist work, which is not necessarily cross-sector, but in schools, because of hierarchies, that there is often a misunderstanding, and often there is a question of, am I here for you, or you here for me? Who is kind of sacrificing something for the other? And sometimes, I think some of that clarification of expectations and maybe synchronizing of vision is really needed. But sometimes I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges in my teaching artist work, is being clear on what the expectations are and what everyone's job is. And I'm serving the people because I don't tend to initiate my own. I tend to work with organizations that place me in places, and then of course teachers or librarians or whoever I'm working with, they've often been tasked or been told, you're getting this person here, work with it. And so I just honor that you seem to have a really textured and nuanced way of working with that. I appreciate that.
Barry, I really appreciate your point, because this is something that I struggle with, because I work with theater as well, so forum theater, and I feel very much in forum theater, I feel myself more, I see myself more as a facilitator, serving the community that I'm working with. And yet when I was doing sustenance, we had a sharing in Singapore with an organization called Arts Walk. And one of the questions that I was asked was, where does your practice fit in such projects? And it's very difficult, you know, like if I'm doing a forum theater project, for example, I don't really care about my practice because it's not the right place to push my art in. If I were to do my art projects, my film projects, for example, then, you know, I would consider like, how am I going to edit it? How is the artistic delivery going to be? And it could be a very individual process, but I would open up some spaces with the social element that's a bit documentary style. But I still know very well that I have a lot of power over film editing. You know, that's my role as a filmmaker, and that's not fully participatory. I know that from the get-go. But not all projects and media allow everything to be super horizontal and participatory. There is still power for an artist in some projects. And then two, I think the more like arts context values that artistic practice. Like if you're gonna be exhibiting somewhere, even if it's a socially engaged artwork, like this question of practice becomes super important and relevant because they are the exhibition serves the artist, which is the star of the show. That is how they're going to sell the tickets and whatever. So then it's a completely different context where I feel it's I'm still struggling between these spaces because socially engaged art doesn't fully fit in all of them. Also because I think art galleries don't necessarily understand socially engaged art. Like also art galleries serve to have an exhibition, you know, like they don't serve to just see community people's faces. Like they want an artistic element to it. So I think this is something that I'm still kind of like reflecting upon. If people here are happy or want to, or there is interest to continue such conversations, you know, we could also continue it into like sustained sessions, because these are things that I'm thinking through as well. Yeah. But you know, what does this mean as well for, I think, okay, I'm going to leave this point to end this up, which is that I think a lot of times institutions, governments define our sector for us and the directions that we go. But isn't it about time that we, as socially engaged artists, start thinking about where we want this sector to go and how we want to present work? What is the best way for it to be presented? What are the expectations? I feel like we need a voice and we need to communicate that, because if it continues top down, I feel like we very rarely then have space for us to digest and reflect what is it that we do and what is it that really serves the work that we do. Not even about serving us, you know, but really serving the work and staying true to the people that we are working with as well through that work.
Reminds me a little of what my close collaborator and someone who is familiar to many people here, Jeff Mather, who's not with us today, but he's a site sculptor, and he talks about when he tells people he's a visual artist and a site sculptor, they say, "Oh, where are you exhibiting? Where can we buy your work?" And he's like, "I don't exhibit. I've never sold a piece. I work in communities." And similar for me, I'm an actor. I don't really appear in theaters anymore. But if people say, "Oh, so you've given up acting?" I say, "No, I act all the time. I act in my performance programs. I act when I do improvisations with students. I act all the time. And sometimes it's much better acting than I used to do when I was on stage."
Yeah. And then there is the added element of like, is that arts or is that social service? And what does it mean to be in the intersection of all these different spaces? I think this is one of the questions of this session as well. Elizabeth, I know you mentioned you have a background in social work. I was
I studied philosophy and art education, both. But in the last year, I heard lectures in social work, especially in the field of cultural work, in the field of social work for students and so on. And therefore, I note that there's a little bit a lack of cultural knowledge in the brain, I will say, of the students. And there's also a turn, I think, in the tradition of social work, because it was very oriented to the term of crisis. This was the center, and I think this was too small, and it was not really full of a humanistic idea and vibration. Then we need more. And cultural turn, or the cultural and social turn, we need both. And we need both together is so important for today, because I see that the war and so on, that some people lost the knowledge of that. And therefore, I tried to implement in social work more artistic thinking or cultural thinking, because I think it's so important to get in better contact to especially to people in conflict situations. I think it's very, very important. And for example, yeah, and therefore I want to combine this. A social term should be also an artistic term. This is my thinking. So you can read poems with people in conflict. It's not crazy. It's a opportunity, a chance to help them to change the situation. But I know a lot of people who think, "Oh, she's crazy," thinking so that. But I think we need those methods and those ideas to get in better condition.
Elizabeth, this is a very important point, because I really think this is why our work is so important, because it connects us with our humanity as well as the humanity of other people, and also like environment and nature. And there is so much within that which people who don't engage with the arts or engage with even meditation and stuff might not even be aware of. And so part of the work that I do for INSEP, I purposely put myself in business spaces and financial spaces, because I wanted to understand what that's about, and why is it that, like about funding, but also why is it that we're stuck in a system in which this economy doesn't serve our society, but we're still going on in that cycle. And I realized that the way that they see the world, because of their background and formative training in business and corporate experience, it's super transactional.
Yeah,
like all the ways that we view relationships in the arts, the way that we see nature, it's completely different from the way that they see the world and relationships between people in society. And I think part of why it's important to cross sectors is not just about creating an exciting, sexy project that brings together different sectors or comes out with financial solutions. It's also about rewiring the narratives that we talk about in society, the cultures that we bring about, the way that we coexist with one another, and the way that we see and view the world, or the way that we respond to the world with humility. And I feel that's something that the arts can contribute. And if we are going to work with businesses or communities, it's not even just about working for the communities by taking business funding. It's also about how could business people experience our arts, and maybe hopefully try and change the system in which they work in, or try and change the corporate cultures that they work in. I spent like almost 1 year talking to people in corporates, and they just tell me that it's super exploitative. The environment, it's like nobody gives a hoot about it. It's all about publicity and like greenwashing, but nobody feels like they're empowered to be able to change anything. And
you should come to Germany. Come to us.
And
we need power too.
Even people who are vice presidents of huge companies, insurance companies, are saying this to me. So I'm like, right, if you as a vice president, you as a CEO don't feel like you have the power to make a difference, who else in a company do you think would have the power would think that they would have the power to make a difference? For CEOs, if they don't perform in 3 months and bring in profits, they could get sacked. So that's the reality of the business world, which means that actually a large part of the business culture needs to be changed, but it's not there yet. And the kind of ways that we see the world, it's not getting to that world. So how could we cross that? There are so many opportunities. this space.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Especially in the lockdown and because in Germany, during the lockdown, the museums were closed, but a small, was the galleries were open because they were business rooms. And so I could go with the students, with the social worker students in the gallery, in the business gallery, and there is a nice business gallery in Munich. And there are a lot of very famous works are represented. And there was a young mother with her child and the buggy, and they found a picture image with the family, and they was sitting 1 hour in front of this picture, and she thought about her whole life and reflected the situation. And it was very, very worthwhile for all of the group who went during this strange lockdown into the gallery. The young people, and not everybody was really young, some were elder, enjoyed it so much. They find nutrition for her soul. Yeah.
You know, there is the social innovation work that I'm doing now. It's a European project. So for people based in Europe, maybe this would be useful for you. There are different social innovation competence centers that will be built up as part of the European project. It's gonna end like mid of next year. So by then they should be in shape, which means that there are actually resources to support social innovation and social entrepreneurship. There might be less funding in the arts, but if you frame the work that you do into a social enterprise, there's a lot more support there, incubation fundings, seed funds that you can access, and they provide like mentorship as well. Check out Social Impact.
I give you my mail address. Perhaps you can send me a link.
Yep, sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's money outside of the arts. Look to like social innovation, social entrepreneurship. There, you know, like the things that are not good in business, they can support.
Yeah, it was really interesting in the gallery with the social workers, because most of them have never been there in a professional gallery. That was the first step in that field for them, but they were really fascinating and completely changed after the 2 hours. It was really astonishing. I could speak now 1 hour, but I stopped now because I had to go now outside, because tomorrow we have festival day, you know, and I had to do my, had to buy milk and so on. Yeah, perhaps we can discuss another time about that point. You are so engaged, You have such a lot of power. It's really fun, really fine.
I actually had another like breakout slide, but then I'm quite conscious we've passed the time and it's probably quite late for some of you. I don't know, Madeleine, if there is energy in the group and you want to continue this conversation, how will it be organized?
You read my mind. I was DMing you in the background just now going, let's have a look at the time. So the best way to stay in touch, which I always recommend, is if you put your email in the chat, and then everyone can save that chat before you log off. And then you'll be able to have everyone's information, all the links that everyone shared. And I tend to leave it open for those 5 minutes after we kind of officially end, so that people have a chance to find links and put them in there and do all that good stuff. And then I know Fié's extended the offer to follow up. And if there's an appetite for follow-up discussions, then that's, you know, creating a Zoom link and emailing it to everyone is super easy. So if there's appetite for that, let me know and we will happily, you know, coordinate something everyone can log back in for. Fié, I know we're kind of past the time, but are there any final comments you want to leave us with? Oh, I was about to say anything you want to share where people can keep up with your work. just maybe a couple of minutes before they go, parting thoughts you want to leave us with?
Subscribe to the podcast. There are really interesting conversations with interesting people at the intersections of spaces that you might be inspired by. And then also I do send out newsletter time to time. So you can subscribe to that via INSEP's website, incepconnect.com. If you join the Facebook group, I share resources from different sectors like social innovation, etc. So if that's useful for you, please do join that. I can only do so much as an individual. So like I can disseminate through my platforms, but I can't reach any further. So yeah, feel free to access the resources there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for joining. I want to remind you all that ITAC 6 is happening in Norway in September, and in-person applications have now closed, but there will be a digital program full of sessions like this, totally different topics, hosted by region and different time zones. But if that sounds like something you're interested in, please make sure you're following ITAC on Instagram and Facebook, keeping an eye on our website, because those programs and how to sign up will be coming soon. So thank you so much for joining. Please join us again next month to look at intergenerational mentorship in teaching artistry space. And the month after, it's not published on our program yet, but we hope to be sharing our new climate engaged artist curriculum, and it should be led by Eric Booth and a couple of colleagues who've been working on that. So there are a ton of ways to stay engaged, and I hope to see you all very soon. I will leave the call open in case you want to be pasting chats and email addresses. Please hit save before you go to make sure you have that. And thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you for your organization.
Thank you for coming and listening to the very
I will write too.